Hey, so I'm gonna do another question today. I got some feedback from the last one. Some people wanted to see what it's like when a coding question is done as if it was like an actual interview, so without as much explanation, just to get a good gauge of what is kind of a benchmark, what it would look like in an interview. And so today I'll do one of these. Um, I won't provide as much explanations of my thought process. So this one will look more like what would happen in an actual interview. It is a little different because there's no interviewer. I can't ask questions and kind of get a gauge of am I on the right track, and it's usually the interviewer is there to help, usually, and they do. They provide helpful hints or say something when something is going down the wrong track. So this will kind of be like a silent video. But what I've actually done is I already did the question and I've recorded it. And so I'm gonna play it back now and add some commentary over this as if I was an interviewer, but not quite because I'm doing this retroactively. And I'll pause and explain things in case something comes up. So let's give this a go. I try to find a question with more upvotes than downvotes, so that's medium difficulty. And I'll pause here. Um, I want to mention that not all the coding questions on LeetCode are actually great interview questions. So interview questions are good if there's not a crazy leap to make, some epiphany you need to have to understand the nature of the problem and come up with a solution. Usually they're a little bit incremental, like a little bit more than trivial. Otherwise, there's a lot of luck involved. It's pretty much who has seen this exact type of question before that you'd be filtering out of the candidates, and you don't really want that. You want to find people who can solve problems. So things that have maybe tricky edge cases that present themselves and that the candidate has to consider, and it can't really tell how good of a question is on LeetCode, how suitable it is for an interview question until um, well, at all really. There's it's kind of a subjective thing. So I tried to. I know you won't really know until you finish the solution either. Like if you have to make a giant leap of some um, epiphany. I didn't end up actually doing this one, even though it looked okay. It seemed a little trivial. I was going to use JavaScript and I was just going to convert the numbers to strings and sort it and then convert them back to numbers, um, which is probably not what this is looking for. It's so without an interviewer here, it's hard to clarify what the intention of the problem is without actually looking at the solution. I could look at the solution and know, oh yeah, that's what the question intended for me to do, but then, by then it's kind of ruined. So this is the one I ended up doing. Just to explain this problem as if I was an interviewer. Um, Given a binary tree, determine if it's a valid search binary tree. And what's outlined here is the criteria for what a binary search tree is, definition of it. And usually maybe the interviewer assumes this, or if not, you can ask. Um, it's totally fine. Like it's not everybody assumes all the terminologies and definitions. In this case, the node of a binary search tree, the value for each node has to be greater, strictly greater, not just greater or equal to, than all of the values on the left side of the tree. And so this 2 has to be bigger than all the values on the left side, um, including the sub elements of 1, if there were any. And 2 has to be less than all the elements on the right. So if you were to traverse it in order, it would be sorted. And this is recursive for each of the subnodes, as the third point says. So it usually takes a couple of minutes for any candidate to soak in this question, what it's supposed to mean, what is it really asking. And usually you can use any language you want in any interview, depending on your experience. Python is probably a good one. It's very easy to read, and there's a lot of helper functions that are kind of just built in. And so I kind of just started coding. That usually you should say what you're going to do, what the solution is to the interviewer. So like you can kind of agree on something that's kind of going to work before jumping in, just to get kind of a green light from the interviewer. I didn't have one in this case, so I just went ahead with it. What I was trying to do here is to validate. It looked like a recursive thing. So the left side must hold true for the same is valid binary tree, and the right side must hold true as well. So I just started with this like base left-right recursion, and of course the base case is the value in the middle has to be more than the value on the left. I was just trying to check out exactly what the data structure was that was going to be given. And at this point, maybe a little bit before this, is when I realized this wouldn't actually work. I was trying to write the base case, and it occurred to me that it is not enough for a node to be greater than the value of its left node and less than the value of its right node, because the node itself actually has to be greater than all of the values on the left side and all the values on the right side. So what occurred to me here is that I'm trying to find ranges. I'm trying to make sure that so I have two choices. I can either pass in what this value is that my current node is downwards as I do recursion to make sure all of the values are less than that, which is what I did here. The other way to do this is bubble that thing up. So given a binary tree, what is the biggest value or the smallest value? And then after the recursion should return that. And then this helper function could compare it based on whether it's the left side or the right side. I can't remember why I went with passing it in. It seemed more natural, and I think it depends on your language too, the language of your choice. Returning multiple values sometimes is just like anything compiled, you have to make a new data structure or something, or a list that's not too intuitive or something. But in this case, JavaScript doesn't actually matter. I could just return an object. So here I'm passing in a minimum and a maximum, which is what the for this binary tree to be valid, for what's passed in for this root. All of the elements in here have to be bigger than minimum and less than maximum. And so this is what I mean by this. This was kind of the leap. that this interview question required, and it's not too big of a leap. The examples given in the LeetCode question page doesn't have this, right? It only had 2 levels. And so it's not clear from that this is something you had to consider. They didn't give you like a very specific example that this is supposed to account for. And that's that would kind of be like giving it away. And so every time we do recursion here, we essentially want to keep the minimum for the left side because we don't care how much smaller it is, but we want to make the maximum stricter. So the maximum now has to be less than our value, and value should be less than the maximum because otherwise this root tree would be invalid. Just doing some cleanup for variable names as I went along. And of course, the maximum and minimums default to null. In the case where we are the root node, the actual root node of the input, there's no maximum or minimum yet, because they can be as small as or as big as they want for this whole tree. And really for any subtree where it's either at the rightmost side or leftmost side, there's no maximum or minimum. So they're kind of just always null. But if you ever get to a subtree where it's kind of in the middle, which is the majority of the case, then node val would be passed as either a min or a max. The formatting doesn't matter that much in terms of like everything. If you were to consider everything, it matters a little bit as for readability. It helps you debug as well, just to make sure that things aren't looking too crazy and you're not closing some parentheses and whatnot. So here I've made a terrible mistake of this is the same call to the right side, but really it should be node val for minimum and then max for maximum, just passing down the maximum. So this was a bug I had that I had to solve, figure out in a bit. Now I'm just trying to come up with examples to test this. I actually think I spend most of the time, or like half the time, testing and debugging, and that's about right, I'd say. That's to be expected. So here I know that the first tree should have returned true. It is a valid binary tree, and I don't know why it's doing false. Having actually coding CoderPad makes me rely on this execution framework more rather than just running this code through in my head first. So here I'm just like adding a bunch of console logs to make sure that it's following the execution path that I expect it to. And the reason I run this in a CoderPad instead of in LeetCode is that it's instant. I think LeetCode, when you try to test something out, it actually queues it up, and getting instant feedback is always good. So here, the console logs I added were to figure out when this function got called and with what parameters, and when it returned false incorrectly. And so here, the last value of this output is 3. It should not have returned false here. That's when I saw that bug up there. Doing some hygiene, cleaning up console logs, debugging statements. And I want to test the test cases that were more complex. For example, I wanted to make sure that all of the values on the left side were actually smaller than the middle value. It's usually a good idea to come up with these test cases yourselves, especially ahead of time, just to wrap your head around the nature of the problem, so you don't end up coding something, finish, and then the interviewer asks, okay, what about this case? And you'd have to step back all the way to the beginning and reconsider everything. And it usually probably gets some bonus points if you finish your solution and then just go directly to testing or enumerating all the test cases to start, and then testing each one to make sure it works, because that's what the interview would ask anyway. Does it work for all test cases? And here I'm gonna add, or I added what I thought the answer was gonna be before I ran it, just so I'm not biased to think that what came out is correct. So that is correct. I would feed it back to LeetCode. That's just a sanity check. It actually compiles. Of course, there's an error. It's kind of annoying that you can't see the whole message, but it sounded like I was trying to call a property on something that was undefined. So it seems like node could be null. And it's without an interviewer, you can't really ask, is the empty tree a valid binary search tree or not? Because it's kind of up to your definition. I just assume that is true, and if this is going to fail again, I just change that to false. Okay, so that worked. Hopefully that gives you an idea of the pacing of what it's like solving one of these problems without all the verbal diarrhea I spit out. Uh, to give some judgment on the question and the solution. So for the question, I'd say this is on the slightly easier end of medium. It's a little tricky. I think part of what's tricky about this question, as in what it's trying to test, is uh, did you consider the case where the middle value has to be bigger than all of the values on the left side of the tree? Um, and I think the question here is framed exactly to hide that example. So all the examples above are pretty easy or pretty trivial, and it's like, did you think about the nature of a binary search tree? The other part of what this question is trying to ask is, how are you going to work your way through the recursion so that you are either passing values down or passing values back up? And so I actually kind of like this part. It gives a relatively good amount of signal. So even if the first part you don't get and the interviewer has to point out, there's still enough work that a candidate would have to do to get this thing to work. Like you'd have to be pretty familiar with recursion. You have to be familiar with how to, what is the nature of passing values around through recursion or passing values back as return values of the recursion and working with that. That requires you to be really familiar with the language of your choice. Requires you to think through pretty clearly, thoroughly of what your function does, what the base case is, and what the recursive case is. And recursion, even though it might not be used all that much on the job, it's thinking about it, thinking it through is very helpful. You can always implement a recursive solution iteratively, but you usually think about recursion first because that's a just natural, more natural frame, natural way of thinking. As for the solution, I'm relatively happy with the solution. It's if I were to see this performance through the eyes of an interviewer, as in, I didn't see the case that it was really trying to ask, and just went straight coding, and I salvaged it. So that's actually pretty decent, but not the best. Like it would be best if I like mentioned that up front. Again, having an interview would actually help. So just to get you talking out loud, part of it is talking to yourself, but part of it is like, hey, interviewer, am I doing the right thing here? But the solution ended up being clean enough. I think some follow-up questions might be, like since this only took, I think, maybe 13 minutes, 10 minutes or so, and the interview might be 30 minutes or 40 minutes, depending on what stage of the thing this is, what stage of the hiring pipeline this is. Some follow-ups could be implement this iteratively without recursion. So that tests another set of coding capabilities. That like, can you just straight up code what you know exactly you need to code, and that one is a more coding intensive exercise, but it gets the interviewer enough signal. Yeah, so hopefully that was useful. I think this is actually not as helpful as the verbal diarrhea one that I did earlier. That one probably gives you a better insight into how to make progress on a new question. So the how of solving questions. And this one maybe sets up a benchmark for the what. Like, what should it look like? How would you know when you've got to some good standing there? I wouldn't say my performance here is like stellar. I imagine like somebody who's really familiar with I guess coding interview questions should probably finish this in like under 5 minutes or just a few minutes. But again, that's not what interviews are supposed to do. Interviews are not supposed to find the person who has most frequently seen this problem. You're supposed to see like can you understand new problems you have not seen before? Can you digest it? Can you understand it? Come up with solutions, alternatives. Talk about time complexity, space complexity, or whatever. So don't worry too much about like the timing of it, but rather can you do it and how did you get there? Timing of it matters since there is kind of a that there's the length of the interview is a deadline. Just knowing how long you have totally helps. So I'll probably do more. I'll do some of this every now and then, but I'll probably do more of the just talking out loud because I like talking to myself really type of videos. And of different varying levels of difficulty and varying kinds of questions. The first one I did was like arrays or two-dimensional arrays or something. It was like a binary or depth first search or breadth first search. And this one was just like a pretty straight up tree type question. So I'll try to vary the content a little bit. And I think one thing that would be pretty helpful is seeing what a mock interview is like in, but like a interviewer and interviewee level interaction. So if you're watching this and you think you would want to see that, let me know. So kind of essentially this format, but there's literally somebody on the other side seeing the same question and coding in real time, and I would be kind of conducting the interview as if this is an interview, just to get a somewhat different perspectives on how different people code. If you're interested, let me know. Comments or whatever YouTubers do. And if you want to be like if you want me to conduct a technical interview with you, I would be happy to do that. I always like talking to new people. If you just want to see like, okay, where am I at? What is the interviewing experience like, especially if you haven't done it before? What kind of hints does the interviewer give, and what is that experience like? How hard am I being pushed? How much pressure would it be? I'll try to make it as realistic as possible. And I would ideally want to upload it to this channel. There won't be a video feed. Your audio would be in here, but we can keep that. We can keep it anonymous, and we can go through the solution, the process of it, the same way we just did in this video. Cool. Until next time.